Hello, class. Welcome to the next segment in the Week 7 material. And in this segment, we're going to be taking a look at the idea of a multidimensional Python list, which, in a more literal sense, is just a list of lists. That is, you have a Python list whose individual elements are also Python lists. And that can be kind of a confusing way to think about this, but that is, in a literal sense, what's actually going on. And we're actually going to show a bit more of a more intuitive approach that we can actually use to tackle the idea of a multidimensional Python list. And if you have trouble thinking about the idea of a list of lists, one of the real world analogies that I like to draw to is you can have, say, a grocery list, a daily agenda, maybe a childcare list. So you've got a list of lists there. You've got a grocery list, a childcare list, and you've got a daily agenda. And on each of those individual items, that is on, like, say, the grocery list, you've also got a list of items there. And on your childcare list, you've also got a list of items there. And on your daily agenda, you've also got a list of items. So that's kind of what we mean by a list of lists. That is, you've got a larger scale list whose individual items are also lists. And that's kind of what we've got declared here on line 2 in this program. So you can see how I have two sets of brackets here. So this outer set of brackets is itself a Python list, and the individual entries of this Python list are also other Python lists. And if we want to see how this is actually going to work, what we actually need to do is we actually need to have two sets of brackets if we're going to pull individual entries out of our uh, Python list that is actually a list of lists, or a multi-dimensional Python list. So let's just focus on one thing at a time and sort of break this down. So here on line 4, I have a print statement much like what we looked at when we first introduced the idea of a list back on week 5. Excuse me. So let's take a look at just this portion right here in isolation. So I want to go into this variable called myList and access item number 0 out of my list. Well, item number 0 out of my list is just simply this. The very first entry in my list is just another Python list. And now out of that particular Python list that I get back from this portion that I just highlighted, I want item number 0 out of that result. So if my list bracket 0 gives me a list that looks like this, if I want item number 0 out of that list, then that just means this particular number here. And if we want to, we can look at a couple more examples of this. So now let's take a look at an example of my list bracket 1. So we've got 3 entries inside of my list: entry number 0, entry number 1, entry number 2. So that will actually correspond to this particular entry, which is also another Python list. And out of that particular Python list, I want item number 0, which would then correspond to this 20 here. And another example, so my list bracket 0 again, or excuse me, my list bracket 1 again. So that's going to be entry number 0, entry number 1, entry number 2. So that's going to be this entry. And out of that particular Python list, I want item number 1, which would correspond to this 40 here. So just summarizing what we just deduced here, we would expect this print statement to print out 10, this would print out 20, and this would print out 40. And if we run this program, we can see it does in fact print out those 3 numbers in that exact order. Now, this might seem kind of confusing here. So let's actually see if we can't state this in sort of a form that is a little bit more intuitive. So let's start with the same exact list, but I'm going to write it a little bit differently here. So instead of writing it out as a list of lists, I'm going to reformat this so it's sort of in terms of a row and a column. That is, in terms of rows and columns, sort of like what you would see if you were to, say, put this in a spreadsheet. And we're going to walk through the same logic that we had before. So again, I want this portion right here, my list 0, which is entry number 0, the 10, 30, 50 list, just like what we had before. And then out of that particular list, I want item number 0, which would correspond to this 10 here. Now, if you think about this in terms of rows and columns, my list bracket 0 would correspond to the very first row in the table that I've re-represented here. And this second 0 would correspond to the column, and you can see the overlap between those two. I get the 10, which is what our program just printed out. And if we take a look at the second case, my list bracket 1 would correspond to this particular list of items. And then the 0 here, out of that list, I want item number 0, which is still column number 0. And you can see the intersection gives me back the 20 that we also got. And if we look at the third example, so again, this same row, but now I want, out of that particular list, I want item number 1, which would correspond to this column. And you can see the overlap between those two. I get the 40 that we also started with. So a much simpler way to think about this is whenever you're going to pull an individual entry out of a two-dimensional list like what we have here, you have two sets of brackets. The number that you put in the first set of brackets is the row number that you're interested in. Again, keeping in mind the computer starts counting at 0. So row number 0 would in fact be the top row. Row number 1 would be this row, and then row number 2 would be this row. And then you have the second set of brackets, and the value that you put in the second set of brackets will correspond to the column number. Again, just by the way that I've written this here. So this would be column number 0, this would be column number 1, and this would be column number 2. And this is going to be especially helpful because it turns out that when you go to read information in from a spreadsheet, which will be part of one of your homework assignments this week, when you go to read information in from a spreadsheet, everything in the spreadsheet is already given in terms of a row number and a column number. And it turns out we've just deduced that we can sort of use the same general approach when we go to pull information out of that same spreadsheet. So we pull information out of a spreadsheet, we want a specific row and a specific column. And turns out we can just simply translate that into Python code like so. So our variable that's holding onto our spreadsheet or our two-dimensional Python list, the first set of brackets tells us what row number we're interested in, and the second set of brackets is the column number that we want to access here. And it turns out that actually works pretty nicely because it gives us exactly what we expect here. And we can also work with something that is, say, a three-dimensional Python list, or a four-dimensional Python list even. We could also do that, but that's something we're going to worry about a little bit later on. And it turns out when you're working with three-dimensional data, it's actually more helpful to think about the data in terms of stacks, rows, and columns, as opposed to just rows and columns, because now there's a third dimension involved. Four-dimensional data gets a little bit more interesting, but we're not going to worry about four-dimensional data sets at all during the course of this class. The most dimensions that we're going to worry about is going to be a three-dimensional data set, and that will be something that we primarily emphasize towards the end of the class, but we will introduce that idea, I believe, a couple weeks from now. So again, just to summarize, when you're going to pull information out of a two-dimensional list, simply take the name of that list, first set of brackets, the row that you want to pull out, the second set of brackets, the column number that you want to pull out, and that will make your life immensely easier, especially if you're able to, if you just memorize this and keep this in mind, this will make your life immensely easier when you go to analyze information that is formatted like a spreadsheet. And whenever you have that information inside of your Python program, this will tell you how to actually think about that particular data set in terms of a row number and a column number, and it's just the ordering of the brackets here. The first number in the brackets, that's the row that you want, and the second number in the brackets is the column that you want. So again, this will be immensely helpful to you, especially on one of the portions of this upcoming assignment where you're actually going to have to work with a spreadsheet file and actually calculate some values. And again, this approach will be immensely helpful to you when you go to tackle that. But that's going to do it for this segment on multidimensional Python lists. And there is one final segment where I'm going to talk a little bit more about the split function, something we introduced way back in segment 1. But I do want to talk a little bit more about how exactly that works, because that is something else that can also be a little confusing at first. So that's what we're going to cover in the final segment. So with that, I will see you all in the final segment.